I never thought a simple question would change everything between us, but that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday night in October, when my roommate Adrian asked me why I never brought girls home. We were sitting on opposite ends of our worn-out couch, half watching some action movie neither of us cared about, when he just turned to me and said it. Not in a judgmental way, just curious, like he'd been wondering for a while and finally decided to ask. I remember my heart doing this weird stuttering thing in my chest, and I could feel heat creeping up my neck. I took a sip of my beer to buy myself a few seconds, trying to figure out how to answer without giving away the fact that I'd been thinking about him in ways roommates definitely shouldn't think about each other. The thing is, Adrian and I had been living together for almost 8 months by that point. We'd met through a roommate finder app when I moved to the city for work, and within the first week I knew I'd lucked out. He was easy to live with, clean enough, funny, considerate about noise and shared spaces. He worked as a graphic designer and kept weird hours sometimes, but we'd fallen into this comfortable rhythm. We'd cook together a few nights a week, nothing fancy, just pasta or stir-fry, and we'd gotten into this habit of watching movies on Tuesday nights because neither of us had much going on midweek. It was comfortable, easy, normal. Except for the part where I'd started noticing things about him that I definitely shouldn't have been noticing. Like the way he'd run his hand through his dark hair when he was concentrating on something, or how he had this laugh that was different depending on whether something was genuinely funny or just polite funny. I noticed that he was always warm, like his body temperature ran hot, because when we'd sit on the couch together, I could feel the heat radiating from him, even when we weren't touching. I noticed the way his t-shirts fit across his shoulders, and how he had these incredibly expressive hands that were always moving when he talked. I noticed everything, and I hated myself a little bit for it. So when he asked me that question, why I never brought girls home, I felt like he'd somehow seen right through me. I managed to shrug and said something about how I'd been focused on work, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd been promoted recently and the job was demanding. Then, because I apparently have no sense of self-preservation, I turned it back on him. Why didn't he ever bring anyone home? And that's when something shifted in his expression. It was so quick I almost missed it. This flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face before he looked away and said he'd been wondering if I'd noticed that. The movie kept playing, but neither of us was watching anymore. There was this tension in the air that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had always been there and I'd just been too scared to acknowledge it. Adrian was picking at the label on his beer bottle, not looking at me, and I could see his jaw working like he was trying to decide whether to say something. Finally he spoke, and his voice was quieter than usual. He said that he hadn't brought anyone home because he wasn't sure how I'd react, and I asked what he meant, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were searching my face for something. He said he didn't bring girls home because he wasn't interested in girls. I should have said something right away, but I just sat there, frozen, because this was real. This was him telling me something important, something true, and I couldn't mess this up. He must have taken my silence the wrong way because he started to backtrack, saying it was cool if that made things weird. He could look for a new place if I was uncomfortable, and that snapped me out of it. I told him to stop, that he wasn't going anywhere, and that he didn't make me uncomfortable at all. Then, because apparently this was the night for honesty, I heard myself saying that I didn't bring girls home for the same reason. The look on his face was something I'll never forget. Surprise, relief, hope, all mixed together. He asked if I was serious, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. We just looked at each other for what felt like forever, and I became aware of how close we were sitting, how I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, how his knee was almost touching mine. He asked how long I'd known, and I laughed, this nervous sound that came out shakier than I intended. I told him I'd always known, but that I'd only recently started admitting it to myself, and by recently I meant the last few months, since living with him actually. He smiled at that, this slow smile that made my stomach flip. He said he'd been going crazy thinking he was the only one feeling this thing between us. He'd catch me looking at him sometimes and wonder if he was imagining the way I'd find excuses to be in the same room, or how I always seemed to lean a little closer when we talked. I couldn't believe we'd both been doing this elaborate dance around each other, both too scared to make the first move. I told him I'd been terrified of making things weird, of ruining the best living situation I'd ever had. He said he'd been thinking the same thing, but that he'd reached the point where not saying anything was worse than the risk of saying something. We stayed up until 3 a.m. that night, just talking. Not about anything heavy, just talking like we always did. Except now there was this new layer of honesty between us. He told me about his college boyfriend, his first relationship with a guy, how it had ended badly and made him cautious about putting himself out there again. I told him about my own fumbling attempts at dating, how I'd spent most of my 20s trying to convince myself I was something I wasn't, and how exhausting it had been. We talked about our families, our fears, our hopes, and somewhere around 2 a.m, when we were both getting tired and our conversation had fallen into comfortable pauses, he reached over and took my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. His hand was warm and slightly rough from his carpentry hobby, and his fingers laced through mine like they'd always belonged there. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't need to. We just sat there, hands intertwined, until we were both falling asleep on the couch. When I finally got up to go to bed, he squeezed my hand before letting go and said goodnight in a way that sounded like a promise of something more. The next few weeks were this strange, wonderful period of figuring out what we were to each other. We didn't rush into anything, which surprised me because I'd spent months wanting to be closer to him. But there was something nice about taking it slow, about letting things develop naturally. We started small. He'd touch my shoulder when he passed behind me in the kitchen. I'd sit closer to him on the couch during our movie nights. We'd have these long conversations late at night, learning things about each other we hadn't known before, even after months of living together. The first time he kissed me was 3 weeks after that initial conversation. It was a Sunday morning and I was making coffee, still half asleep in my t-shirt and sweatpants. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. I froze, not because I didn't want it, but because I wanted it so much it scared me. He asked if this was okay, and I managed to nod. He turned me around, and I could see he was nervous too, which somehow made me feel better. When he finally kissed me, it was soft and tentative, like he was asking a question. I answered by kissing him back, and everything else just fell away. I wish I could say everything was perfect after that, but real life doesn't work that way. We had to figure out how to be roommates and boyfriends at the same time, which was harder than it sounds. We had our first fight about a month in, something stupid about dishes and whose turn it was to clean the bathroom, but it felt bigger because we were both scared of screwing this up. We'd raised our voices, said things we didn't mean, and then I'd stormed off to my room. I sat there feeling miserable, thinking about how I'd ruined everything, when I heard a soft knock on my door. Adrian came in and sat on my bed, not touching me, just sitting there. He said he was sorry, that he'd overreacted, and that he was still figuring out how to do this. I told him I was sorry too, that I'd been an arse about the whole thing. He smiled and said we were both asses, which made me laugh despite myself. Then he said something that's stuck with me ever since. He said that he'd rather fight with me and work through it than not have me in his life at all. He said I was worth the difficult conversations, worth the learning curve, worth all of it. That's when I realized I was in love with him. Not just attracted to him, not just enjoying the newness of the relationship, but actually in love. It terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. I didn't tell him right away because I didn't want to scare him off, but I think he knew. He had this way of looking at me sometimes, like he could see right through all my defences to the truth underneath. We settled into a new kind of normal after that. We were more careful with each other, more intentional about communication. We'd check in regularly, make sure we were on the same page about everything from how much time we spent together to how we handled our relationship around friends. Speaking of friends, that was its own adventure. My best friend Tyler was the first person I told, and his reaction was basically to say it was about time, that he'd been wondering when I'd figure out I was into Adrian. Apparently I'd been way more obvious than I thought. Adrian's friends were equally unsurprised, which made us both laugh about how much time we'd wasted being scared. His best friend Ethan actually said he'd been taking bets on when we'd finally get together. It was embarrassing and reassuring at the same time, knowing that other people had seen what we'd been too scared to acknowledge. The hardest part was telling our families. I called my mum on a random Wednesday evening and my hands were shaking the entire time. I'd practiced what I wanted to say, but it all flew out of my head the moment she answered. I ended up just blurting it out, that I was seeing someone and it was Adrian, and he was a guy, and I was sorry I hadn't told her sooner, but I'd been scared. There was this pause that felt like it lasted forever, and then she asked if I was happy. I said yes, happier than I'd been in a long time. She said that was all that mattered to her, and could she meet him properly sometime soon? I may have cried a little after we hung up. Adrian's family was more complicated. His parents were divorced, and his relationship with his dad was strained at best. He'd come out to his mom years ago and she'd been supportive, but his dad was a different story. He decided to tell him over dinner, and he asked if I'd come with him for moral support. I sat in the car outside the restaurant watching him walk in alone because he'd said this was something he needed to do himself, and I'd never felt more helpless. When he came back 40 minutes later, his eyes were red, but he was smiling. His dad hadn't taken it well, but he hadn't rejected him outright either. It was a start, Adrian said, and that was more than he'd hoped for. We celebrated our 6-month anniversary in April. We didn't do anything fancy, just cooked dinner together and watched the sunset from our apartment's tiny balcony. Adrian gave me a key, which made me laugh because I obviously already had a key to the apartment. He said it wasn't about the apartment, it was symbolic. It was his way of saying he was all in, that he wanted this to be real and long-term. I kissed him and told him I was all in too. Had been since that Tuesday night when he asked me about bringing girls home. Looking back now, I can't believe how close we came to never having this. If he hadn't asked that question, if I hadn't asked it back, we might have spent months or years dancing around each other, both too scared to make the first move. It makes me think about all the people out there who are in similar situations, scared to speak their truth because of what they might lose. I get it, I really do, because I was that person. But I also know now that the risk was worth it. Living with Adrian, loving Adrian, has taught me things about myself I didn't know. It's taught me that I'm braver than I thought, that I'm capable of being vulnerable, that I can handle difficult conversations and come out stronger on the other side. It's taught me that love doesn't have to be complicated or dramatic, that sometimes it's as simple as finding someone who makes you laugh, who challenges you to be better, who sees all your flaws and chooses you anyway. We're still figuring things out, still learning how to be partners in this life we're building together. We've talked about getting our own place eventually, something that's just ours from the start, not a roommate situation that turned into something more. But for now, we're happy where we are. Our apartment is filled with both our things now, his art prints on the walls next to my bookshelves, his cooking equipment mixed in with mine in the kitchen. It's messy and imperfect and absolutely perfect at the same time. Sometimes I'll catch him looking at me while I'm reading or working, and he'll have this soft expression on his face that makes my heart skip. I'll ask him what he's thinking and he'll say nothing, or everything, or that he's just happy. And I get it, because I feel the same way. After years of feeling like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, of trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me, I finally feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. So yeah, my roommate asked why I never brought girls home, and I asked him the same thing. And that simple exchange of questions changed everything. It gave us permission to be honest, to be vulnerable, to take a chance on something that scared us both. And I'm so grateful he asked. Grateful I asked back. Grateful for every moment that led us to where we are now. Because this, us, is worth every moment of fear and uncertainty it took to get here.